Season 3 of Ding Dong Darkness Time is sponsored in part by Local Hero Press, a publisher of quality fiction. With its entire catalog available in audio, you can hear works such as Ian Thomas Healy's long-running and popular Just Cause universe of superhero novels. You can also grab Allison Dixon's terrifying novel Strings, yeah, that's me, and even Healy and Dixon's co-authored epic steampunk adventure The Oilman's Daughter. All Local Hero Press audiobooks are available from Audible and iTunes, and you can find them in ebook and print from every online retailer, including Amazon and Smashwords, or ask your favorite indie bookstore to order you a copy. All you little ding-dongs who love a great read should visit localheropress.com for more information. Now, on with the show. Well, hello there, everybody. If the different intro wasn't already a clue something was up, then let me just go ahead and welcome you aboard for the long-awaited Ding Dong Darkness Time Season 3 Class of Cults. I'm your host, Allison Dixon, and if you discovered this show during the long streak of short solo episodes I've been running lately, then I hope you'll stick around for the longer form version because we have so much ground to cover. And if you want to learn more about cults, I hope this will be a premier podcast destination for you over the next couple months. I'm also not making this maiden voyage into season 3 alone today. In fact, the two people with me for this episode are so amazing and so important to me that I don't even know what to do with myself right now. So I'm just going to introduce them. The first guest will be very familiar to anyone who's listened to the first 2 seasons of this show. Class has just resumed session over on his amazing podcast, 80s High. But I continue to be grateful for any time he's set aside to visit the dark dungeon. Say hello to King Ding Dong himself, Chris.
It's so good to be back. Hello, everyone. Hello, Allison.
Yes, I know. And I have to remember how to talk to people again because I've been doing so many solo episodes that podcasting with other human beings is a skill I have to relearn. So
we're just going to sit back and let you vamp as long as possible. Just see how long it takes. You're like, oh, yeah, there's other people on here. Oh, yeah.
That will happen. Oh, yeah.
Right.
Okay, so I don't want to wait any longer to bring our second guest on. I've been wanting to get him on here since the show's beginnings. I first met this person way back in 2005 when I walked into my first Psych 101 class and addressed him as my professor. And after miserably failing the first test of his I ever took, I somehow, over the course of several misadventures, went on to become this man's friend. He wasn't only my psych professor, however. He is a forensic psychologist and currently serves as the chief psychologist for the Washington State Department of Corrections. And we'll just refer to him here as Dr. Bart. Dr. Bart Abplanalp, here you are. Say hello, sir.
Hi, it's so good to be here. I am. I didn't realize that you failed your first test. I'm almost like don't want to be on the show now.
It was an Allison. It was an Allie F. It was an Allison F. It was definitely like it was a low C. Actually, I barely passed it. It was like a 70%. I was ashamed of myself. That was bad. But to be fair, everybody failed.
Well, to be fair, the rest of the class was pretty stupid, but I was expecting more from you.
If anybody,
I could tell.
Oh my God.
From the moment I saw you, I'm like, here's a person that's going to basically shame herself for getting a C.
Well, not only that, I did go on to form a study group in your class so that I could raise all the boats with the tide in the hopes that we will never fail another one of your very difficult and impossible tests. So,
you sound very socialistic of you. I appreciate that.
Well,
so ahead of your time.
I know. I'm just saying I'm one of those people that knows how to anticipate the needs and demands of other people. So once I saw what you were all about, I was like, oh God, I'm really going to have to work for this one. So that's what I did.
I do want to make the caveat that my views are mine alone, and they do not reflect the Department of Corrections or any of my professional affiliations.
Exactly. Let Bart have his fun. Okay.
Yeah.
He's here to talk cults and offer his expertise. And Chris is also a psych major, has a psych degree. Bart is a PhD. I am a failure in life, but I am an enthusiast.
You're an enthusiastic
stop.
failure.
Oh, stop.
No, I mean, I'm just saying that I think when we put our three minds together on something like this, I just think we'll be able to cover a lot of ground and hopefully introduce people to a lot of concepts that maybe they aren't familiar with outright, or something that will help them understand why the hell people behave the way they do, especially whenever it comes to groups behaving in groups, and how those groups can lead to cults. Like, what is that process that is involved? That's something that has always fascinated me. I think I've probably always been more of the sociology kind of person rather than the individual, just because I think the way people behave and the way it shapes societies is something I've always questioned. I've always wondered about. And in studying cults, I feel like that is a really good way to help maybe understand how we all operate, how we're all vulnerable in our own way to falling into some of these traps. And that's one big reason I wanted to do this season in the first place. And we'll get to the definition of the word cult and how that is actually defined both formally and in terms of pop culture. But I wanted to talk about this especially because I feel like people, when they think of cults, they think of Heaven's Gate, the suicide cults, the Jim Jones. They think of these sort of big stories, but they don't realize that behavior, that mindset is everywhere around us. And it's even more so, it's even more pervasive thanks to social media that has turned certain cultic behaviors into global phenomenon. If we look at, say, QAnon, for instance, something that started on a 4chan bulletin board back in the 2000s is now infiltrated governments all over the world. How did that happen? Well, I want to help answer that question, or maybe we can help answer that question.
It's very different with headphones on. I'll just tell you that. Like when I have headphones on, I'm like, it feels like I have to be cued to talk. It's a very weird environment that I'm in. I guess you guys are used to it, but
I think it'd be more natural if we were all sitting around a table together with mics.
Yeah.
For sure. I agree. Well, Allison and I did a live show when we were in Vegas, and it felt just a bit more natural, I think.
Yeah, it was pretty awesome. It really had me feeling like, God, I need to create a headquarters somehow, somewhere where you could just bring everybody in and have face-to-face conversations. It makes you wonder if cults would exist with Zoom. How do you have a good cult through Zoom? I just feel like people can't even do regular office jobs with Zoom.
Teal Swan's probably a close example.
That's a very good point, Chris.
Mhm.
I mean, it's not so much a Zoom cult as it is social media, but still. It's based off YouTube, I think, right? Isn't she on YouTube?
She is. She
Or
is.
TikTok.
well, I think
one of
that's
those,
probably going to become I mean, this is the new normal, really. And I hate using that terminology, but we have generations now of people that are growing up that haven't known anything but this. Mm-hmm. And I think from my perspective, I grew up with going outside and actually experiencing the graphics out there, and that was obviously less reliance on technology because we just didn't have it. And I'd really be interested to see some brain studies and take a look and see how the actual brain structure and chemistry are different in in kind of a cross section now, as opposed to an older generation or somebody from who's not been inundated with this level of technological onslaught.
That's a very good point. And honestly, we'll be talking a little bit too about how the brain structures can change over time with behavior changes and ritualistic behaviors and things like that, and how that can have both a good thing and it has a good connotation and a very bad one, depending on what your goal actually is. When it comes to talking about cults and cult-like thinking, I think people they use a lot of shorthand. They just say the word brainwashing and think that explains everything. They use the term cult to refer to literally anything that involves a group of people getting together with a similar goal. But it's a lot more complicated and complex than that, as always, of course. But I want to talk about the formal definition of cult. Let's just start there. So Merriam-Webster defines the word cult in a few different ways. First being a formal religious veneration, a system of religious beliefs and ritual, also its bodies of adherents, a religion regarded as unorthodox or spurious, also its body of adherents. So we're referring to the religion and the group itself. A system for the cure of disease based on dogma set forth by its promulgator, health cults. Let's see, a great devotion to a person, idea, object, movement, or work as a film or book, especially such devotion regarded as literary or intellectual fad. The object of such devotion, usually a small group of people characterized by such devotion. So this definition uses religion a lot, and it also has a way of generalizing people who are devoted to a person, idea, object, or movement. So Trekkies could fall under the definition of a cult by this definition, which I feel is a little unfair. Or somebody who's really into Marvel movies, or somebody who's really into Star Wars. These aren't cults per se. They may kind of have similar traits, but that's not what I'm after here. We're not after those people. You enjoy your Star Wars, you enjoy your Trekkie conventions. Nobody's coming after you here, at least on my podcast. Although some of your fandom is a little nuts, but whatever. Also, the formal definition centers so much on religion, and many destructive cults are not religious in basis. You have Synanon, which started out as a alcohol dependency. It was like an AA kind of situation, like breaking your dependence on drugs or alcohol. We have the Symbionese Liberation Army, the people who kidnapped Patty Hearst. That was a political cult. You have multi-level marketing companies that largely behave as cults, destructive cults. And I'll be going after them pretty hardcore in a future episode. We have Aum Shinrikyo out of Japan, who is a doomsday cult. There are so many different kinds of cults that have nothing to do with religion. So I feel like, again, we have to be a little careful too when we look at some of these new religious movements or alternative religious movements. There are so many of those, right? Most of them quite harmless. They're not hurting people necessarily. So it isn't so much about what a cult believes, but about how it behaves when determining whether it is destructive. So we look at things like social isolation, prescribed bad behaviors like harming other people or self-harm, banning things like medical care and medicine, demanding family estrangement. Of course, then you can also get into sexual abuse and other very rigid forms of conformity. That's when you start to see the destructive side of a cult. So if the Trekkies started acting this way, then they would get lumped in too. It isn't just enough to put on your Spock costume and go hang out for a weekend at the convention center.
That's how it starts. So, that's the conventions are the gateway.
Right.
Are we saying really the Trekkies are the gateway?
I'm not saying they are. I'm saying they're an example of what could be a gateway. I think what's interesting about the definition that you mentioned too is what's not in it, and this may reflect just my own my own interpretation of it. But when I hear the word cult, there is almost there's the garb that goes with it, right? The way of dressing, but also and you mentioned isolated, which I think is interesting. But it's a location. Usually, I mean, and historically, it would have to have been an isolated location, separated physically from other people. And I think that's one of the things that Teal Swan and the internet and social media have really made ubiquitous is you can hide from anywhere.
Right.
So you can hide in your own home and you can be isolated because, the need that drives some of the cults, and most of them, there's a deep need inside of them that is attractive, that the cult is feeding. Right. And so you're going to get that however you can get it. And so if you can't get your prescribed opioids, you're going to get heroin. And
right.
if you don't have the ability to, independently go and live somewhere or join someplace, then you can do it from the comfort of your own home or basement or wherever.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And you're right about that being a newer version. And that's why I think Merriam-Webster should really update their definition, because I think in terms of though of like social isolation, meaning like too that I'm shutting out anybody who doesn't believe as I believe. So you're creating your thought echo bubble chamber around you, whether that's in the flesh or online. So, we tend to see a lot of this happen when you could say, yes, I'm curating my feed, my social feed. Well, that's great. You shouldn't have to deal with, say, trolls online. But if it does turn into a situation of, I am only going to talk to people who are devotees of this person, that's, and I start to shut out the other people who are not because that person told me to. And I will talk about that other person because that's the other thing a cult needs. They need a charismatic leader, guru. They are essential and will usually exhibit certain traits. So they become not so much a leader anymore. They become an object of worship and devotion. They end up using coercive persuasion and thought reform techniques, which is a sort of more broken down and more useful terminology than brainwashing, which we can get into a little bit later. And they're usually exploiting their followers in some way, usually economically, often sexually, or both. They usually make it hard, for people to leave. They exact these sort of exit costs that, like, if you leave this group, then you're going to lose, say, all the progress that you have made to attain the higher level. So, like Scientology, for instance, these people have invested tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars on these programs for Dianetics to attain these different levels of Scientology. And then what do they do when you've reached a certain level? They change the rules. So then you have to buy in again and keep learning. And you can't leave because, well, now I've already spent so much money. And what do they call that? Oh, I've spent so much, I might as well keep going. That's sunk cost.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So it preys on that a lot. Like if I put in so many years and so many dollars, or I've abandoned my friends and family outside this thing, that's what the guru or cult leader gets people to do. And they exist all across the board with these groups.
Yeah, and really the end goal is to de-individualize the members, right? Your feelings aren't valued, they're minimized. There's no questioning, there's no dissent. There's zero tolerance for that, right? So in a lot of ways, it is making sure that everyone is conforming to this message. And ultimately, the idea that, whatever the end goal, you said they're destructive. Typically, there's some kind of end goal, or there is an end in some way. And the idea is that whatever that end is, it justifies any of the means to get there. It's all consuming in a way.
So first of all, I am getting excited about this just because there's so much social psychological terminology that is popping into my head that can, you're talking about sunk cost and, confirmation bias and
this is why I invited you
cognitive
here,
dissonance.
Bart.
Yeah, this is stuff that I'm getting intellectually hard about. I don't know. Sorry, it's a PG audience. My bad.
No, I guess we're not. No, we're not PG. What are you talking?
We're editing that one out. But I'm curious to see where this goes, really, in terms of talking about delusional thinking and the idea behind these. So delusion being a belief that is firmly held but has little to no basis in reality.
Well, see, that's one reason I wanted a psychology expert here, is because I find myself constantly towing that line between someone who is acting very much with their own agency. They are making choices. And that's the thing that I think separates, and we'll get to brainwashing a little bit later in more detail, but I think that's what separates, this idea of, people say, oh, they were brainwashed. Well, you've just went ahead and removed that person's ability to make choices for themselves, which they did. They made choices that got them to that point. But at what point does their choice end and the delusion begin? Because I do wonder, when does it become delusional?
And I think Chris makes a good point that there's an end goal, right? Mm-hmm. And so when you're talking about a cult, you're talking about a group of people. And, if you look at the parallels for people who might say, well, I wouldn't ever be part of a cult, that wouldn't ever happen, which is exactly what everybody who's part of a cult initially says.
Yeah.
But, a pared down version of that is a toxic relationship, right? Where you have someone who grooms you who their end goal is control, and their audience of one is you, and they will isolate you from the rest of your family. But their goal, their end game, is not to get a following like that. That's a different end goal for that leader, for the identified leader there, and the leader in a dyad relationship, right, where you have usually a man, but it can be a woman, that is restricting choice, restricting movement, and eventually, again, for lack of a better term, brainwashing somebody into giving up their freedom and becoming integrated and de-identified. The difference, I think, is more a matter of degree with cults as far as their reach is concerned. But I think that a lot of people can identify with getting involved in something and losing yourself, and not having a way built into there to objectively kind of say, hey, this is going too far. And there, I can't tell you how many people get into that situation with a relationship, and it just becomes, that they become a cult of two. You can have somebody with like one crazy belief, right? And a crazy belief might be a delusion. And in psychology, if two people have that crazy belief, it's a folie à deux, right? It's a shared psychotic delusion.
I just did an episode on that, by the way.
Did you?
Go check that out.
We can expand on that.
Yeah, for sure. And Chris, when he heard that episode, and he mentioned too that, that could be an interesting thought process that could feed into the cult season, because you're absolutely right. That idea of the shared delusion, the way it can catch on like wildfire, and the things that make that more feasible are things like social isolation or dependency on the other person. And I did one, it was about a family in Australia that I mentioned in the show, how they had the father had this big mental breakdown, and was believing that his people were coming after his money, coming after his property. And so he piles the family into the car and starts driving just as far as he can drive. And the mother had fallen for it. The other kids had fallen for it. And they ended up scattered all across the country over time, because one broke away who thought, these people are crazy, I'm leaving. Like, it didn't catch on for him. But for the rest of the kids, they all had some degree of it. The cops ended up finding the father just wandering the side of the road. He'd been harassing other people and, things for days. And they brought him in, and they eventually had to kind of, quote unquote, deprogram him, and medicate him and get him back to his normal state. And the rest of the family sort of followed suit. And now they're kind of back to normal now for the most part. But it was like a very much a shared delusion that they all had, and they're a family. So it makes sense that happens. They're sharing a roof together. They're sharing a livelihood together. If one breaks, then it kind of like rolls downhill. You're mentioning again family, which is what it comes down to. And when you've got these people that are sharing it within a family, I mean, you get 5, 6, 7, 10 of them, then it's not necessarily a cult. I mean, it's more like a treatment group, really. But once you get into more than 10, I would consider that to be, I don't know if there's a hard and fast line, but more than 10 is a cult. And then once you get a 501(c)(3) status, it's a religion. So once you get tax exempt status
Zing.
for your beliefs, then
Scientology.
then you're a religion.
Yes.
Well, and I think what we're talking about here, whether it is that dyad or a family member, in this case, a father who isn't an authoritarian figure, is, Allison, you found this really great quote, but that is like, there's a really salient single feature of a lot of these cults, and it is that absolute authoritarian leader who defines and controls the followers. And I think that's often what will happen, whether you're grooming a spouse to have complete control over everything. And Allison, you and I love true crime. There's quite a few stories where that is exactly what's going on. And it's usually the husband. And so it was interesting to me. I don't know if you want to get into that quote or not, but I thought that was just kind of a really interesting encapsulation.
And that'll actually give me an opportunity right now to address the sources that I am going to largely be using, not just for this episode, but for all of them. That quote that Chris mentioned came from the book Cults Inside Out by Rick Alan Ross, who has worked for many years in the sort of deprogramming, the cult intervention work that had a kind of controversial period during the 70s and 80s, because it ran afoul, that work ran afoul of the law and the Constitution in many ways, because when a lot of family members were losing their other family to, say, a cult, let's say they ran off and joined the Rajneeshis in Oregon or something like that, they would try to get somebody to get that family member out of there. Well, if you were actually taking someone and transporting them elsewhere, what is that called? Against their will?
Kidnapping.
Yeah. And so a lot of these cult interventionists were being charged with kidnapping, and they were being charged with unlawful like holding of people because these people didn't come willingly. And so that's where you kind of run afoul. And the courts have very much supported people's ability to say, hey, it's your right to go be brainwashed in a cult, I guess. And the family just kind of has to deal with that because they still have their own rights. They still have their own individuality. You can't just go and grab someone and force them back into the light. And so he talked a lot about that experience and how he doesn't deal with that kind of stuff anymore because, well, he had already gone to court and been charged with kidnapping a couple times in his effort to help families. And so it's very hard. It's a very hard line that you have to walk. And that book is fantastic. And then there's also Cultish by Amanda Montell. It's The Language of Fanaticism is the subtitle there. Fantastic, very short read, easy read that talks all about the language that is used by cults in order to subvert thought, the whole thought reform, that I'll be using that term a lot throughout this entire season. Another term that she brought in was thought stopping cliche, which is the words used in order to prevent people from having a common sense, rational thing like, maybe I shouldn't be giving more money to this organization. They come up with all these slogans to stop people in their tracks. Fantastic book. And then there was also Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism by Robert J. Lifton, and Cults in Our Midst by Margaret Singer. All of these books are also referred to by Rick Alan Ross in his book. That's how I actually learned about them and went and got them.
And do you mind if I finish out that quote too? Because I only read the first part. All right. So the most salient single feature of most destructive cults is that an absolute authoritarian leader essentially defines and controls them. A single leader is most often the sole authority, but at times an elite ruling coterie or a small group of leaders function in that pivotal position of power. And I think that's going to come up in a lot of these that you'll cover throughout the season. It's not always necessarily a person. There's often like henchmen or women or whatever. And the group can therefore be seen as primarily personality driven and functionally defined by its living leader or leaders. And I just thought that was a really interesting encapsulation because sometimes you do have that one figurehead, but in other cases you might have this group of, sub leaders of those underneath, and they're also primarily kind of reinforcing and driving that cult culture that the leader has sort of created.
That's a big one in, for instance, the FLDS cult, the Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints. I'm separating them from the regular Latter-day Saints church because that's a sticky subject. I'm just going to say I'm not going to come after mainstream Mormons at this point. I'm really looking at their offshoot led by William Jeffs, who is currently in prison, but he always had different bishops and leaders running things, in his stead. And Scientology, that's another one. When L. Ron Hubbard passed away, there were plenty of people ready to take over in his stead. He had built an entire organization. And so a lot of these cults, if they get really well grounded and really well founded and funded, then they will have those henchmen. They will have that ruling government essentially. And it just makes everybody beneath them even more, I think, held in place than if it's just one guy.
I think the Rajneeshis did as well, right? I think there's one particular woman who was kind of like the second in command for.
She was
him.
the one who was poisoning everybody. Oh man, we'll definitely talk about. Bart, are you familiar with the Rajneeshis that took over that town in Oregon? Have you?
Yes. Yeah, they're close. They're close enough.
Yeah.
To where I am. Yeah. And the idea that you can have, I'm curious about the phenomena of, why does it one would be a singular leader and others would have a coterie of my guess is, and we may be getting into this, but my guess is that there's at least an element of growth
Yeah.
You know, the bigger you get, the less your individual reach can necessarily be. So you have to become almost mythical in that regard. And in order for you to be watching over everybody, there have to be some, there has to be, arms of that everywhere. So I'm curious to see what some of these authors and researchers and those who've done the deep dive into it make of, what's qualitatively different about a cult that has a singular leader and those that have kind of shared leadership. And one of the things I just cynically wonder about the leaders, if they're not able to be present all the time. Mm-hmm. And the question is, why are they not able to be present all the time? They have another life out there, or they're out, proselytizing elsewhere or whatever. But anyway, and just thinking out loud, it's curious to me that I imagine there's a slightly different phenomena that's going on.
A lot of times these cults are offshoots of the more mainline religions that they came from. And to mention the FLDS church again, but there are a number of other ones that are like this. I think if you're
going Branch Davidians an offshoot as well.
Branch Davidians, yes, they were, and they didn't have very far to go by the time they were in that compound. I think that was one of those things. And this is what I've discovered too, with the cults that have like your one charismatic leader situation, that sort of ruling structure that's almost monarchical, is they paint themselves into a corner and they can't get much further. Heaven's Gate was another one. They were run by a duo up until one of them died. She died of cancer. Bonnie Nettles, I think was her name. And then the head guy, which I can only remember him as
Marshall Applewhite.
Thank you very much. They were a very small group. And so I think there were only like 12 to 15 of them tops in that cult. But I think you either have to be very small and not grow beyond that little system, or if you do try to grow bigger and you haven't developed like this thing beyond this nebulous concept ruled by one person, then I think eventually you will die off, which is ultimately what happened with Jim Jones. He was the only leader, is the only real leader. He lost his mind. Then, of course, the Heaven's Gate cult had an end game, and they achieved that. But then you look at something again like FLDS or Scientology or Children of God, which operates under a different name now that is completely escaping me. They're still around. They're still an organized religion, heavy air quotes around those two words. You have to get that organizational structure, I think, in place if you expect your cult to grow. Multi-level marketing companies also have a very rigid structure. You have the people who buy in, and then you have your upline. That's the person overhead of you who makes money off the sales of everybody below them, including you. And then you rise up that hierarchy. There's always another level to climb. And so if you're going to be very successful and grow and have that ruling coterie of people, you need structure. And that's what some of the most successful destructive cults have done. They have managed to organize into something that its followers recognize as a government of sorts, a church structure. The most successful organizations out there have a hierarchy, and, including corporations. So there it is right there. Otherwise, I think you are just somebody out there in the middle of a jungle or in the middle of a cow town or something, just waiting to see what happens. Those people usually do die out pretty quickly, at least after a few years. But we're here to talk about the psychology, and we're gonna take you back to Psych 101 here.
Yeah, I'd also like to throw out there. I mean, Bart is our resident expert. Dr. Bart, my apologies. Dr. Bart, our resident expert here.
You're not my patient. It's okay.
So Dr. B is like the freaking genius here. But I just want to throw out there, I did teach intro psychology for several years. So, I think I'm very excited as well because I've left that behind and I don't often get to dig back into that knowledge. So I'm very excited. And I did a lot of homework and I'm like, oh, I remember this person. I remember this. It was very exciting. So I don't usually get to throw that credential around. So I'm very excited to be able to do that today.
This stuff is so foundational. And I've taken, Bart's Psych 101 wasn't the first Psych 101 I ever took. I took a couple running starts at college before I, took his class, but it was easily the one that made it stick the most, because I don't think the classes that I took previously dug quite as deep into these things as we're about to, and as Bart did in my class, which essentially got me hooked, because once I learned about these things, and I was like, oh God, this is why the Nazis happened, things like that. And when you really start to understand the way humans are very obedient by nature and how that has a lot of pitfalls. And so we're going to jump right into the obedience study done by Stanley Milgram. And this was this in the 60s? Is that right?
Yeah, 1961.
It was when the world was still pretty much black and white. Like we didn't have color yet.
Then here's the brilliant thing. This also existed in the time before, say, informed consent was something we considered like, oh, I don't know, standard operating practice, right? Whereas, I don't think that this study would be able to be done.
No, there's an institutional review board. Anything you do, if you're giving someone a survey, you have to get it cleared by the IRB or you don't get to do it. And yeah, all of these foundational studies, I'm going to guess in their original state would not even come close. We'll talk about some of these. There have been adapted versions of them being done under modern standards, but you're not getting this or the Zimbardo's Stanford prison study. No way.
No, not at all. And we'll definitely be talking about that one as well, because that is that thing was almost just like a cultural phenomenon in and of itself. I mean, it generated
it's a little bit of a hot mess.
Yeah, a little bit. I think Zimbardo himself would definitely agree.
Well, Milgram is, we'll talk about this. Milgram's study has been replicated. You can't really say that for the prison study, but anyway, Milgram was really interested in researching how far people would go in obeying an instruction if it involved harming another person. And really the inspiration of this came from World War II. And you mentioned the Nazis and why in the Holocaust. And was Eichmann and his accomplices, millions of them, were they just following orders? And, so that's really, I think, what spurned his interest in understanding the psychology or the sociology of people doing that.
A very important questions to ask, I think, even in this day and age, is like, where do you draw that line between following orders and not? And as this study will show, or did show, it's very surprising if you're not prepared for it. So basically, there's an experimenter and then there's a teacher. And I'm going to maybe explain this very poorly. This is why you guys are here. But basically, they're directing the teacher to deliver electroshocks to learners that are on in a different room, right?
That is correct.
And they're trying to, if they don't answer a question correctly, if the learner doesn't answer a question correctly, then the teacher is ordered to deliver an electroshock to the learner.
Yes.
And those shocks start at very low on the threshold and go.
It's 15 volts, I believe.
Yes. And they go up to 400? I think
450.
450. And then XXX. Just after that, it's.
Oh, you're right.
Yes.
There was a mysterious unlabeled.
It's the 11, basically. It's the Spinal Tap version is the XXX equals 11 on those.
That's right.
The crux of it is focused on what the teacher does.
Correct.
Under direction by the experimenter.
Yeah. Man in a white coat is telling you what to do.
And you can't see the learners. You can only hear them. So if you are being told to shock someone that you can't see in another room, then do you do it? And if you're received that order, by the way, the teacher, the person delivering the shocks, has no idea that the learners in the other room are in fact actors.
Yeah.
This is the other part. They're not really being shocked, but the teacher doesn't know that.
And they can hear the person crying out in pain and agony as they're delivering this shock.
Yes. So you can kind of see where this is headed. And I believe there were 50, and there were 50 subjects in this. Something about 60% of the teachers, so the people pushing the button to shock the people in the other room, over time ended up following orders to deliver the highest level of voltage to the people in the other room.
And all the participants went to 300 volts. One thing that's I think should be noted here, and I've seen videos from this study. I've shown them to students when I taught. And what should be very clearly stated here is these were not people who were like, well, so it goes. And, you think of like a maniacal relish of someone like, yes, I get to do it. They were highly, highly disturbed in doing this, protesting to the experimenter. And the responses were always, please continue. The experiment requires you to continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice but to continue. So I think it's very easy to just think of people like maybe being a little flippant about it or a little devilish or demonic, but these teachers were highly, highly terrorized, basically, because they could hear people scream. And there were some times that the person just didn't respond. And the teacher thought that the person had passed out. And they're still ordered to deliver the shock, even though they think the learner is unconscious in the next room.
You bring up a couple of really salient points about the study. And one of them is that, when they first get in there, you have this person who's basically taking part in a psychology study. And they go into a room and they've got this other person there who's what's called a confederate, right? It's the person who's in on the experiment. And they act as if this person in a white lab coat, all the trappings of a legitimate scientist, doctor at the time, comes out there and they're saying, okay, well, you choose from my hand one of these two. You're going to either be a teacher or a learner, and they pick it out. Well, they both say teacher, and so the person that's grabbed the learner is in on it, and so he says, yes, I got learner, whatever. But so one of the things that you start off with is that the quote unquote teacher in this believes, at least it's on some level, that they could have just as easily been the learner. And so that lends to the legitimacy of it. And the thing about the study that fascinates me to this day is that you're right. It wasn't some maniacal glee that you found a bunch of psychopaths to go in there and do this. That two things. One is that there was a lot of hesitation. And if you see these videos, you can see the teacher, and I don't like using that term just because it makes it sound like the person's really in charge, but you can see the real true test subject here, looking back at the person in the lab coat, kind of like, hey, he doesn't sound so good in there. Can you go check on him? And again, this you have to continue. The experiment requires you to continue, and so they're really hesitant. They're like, okay, well, fine, I'll do it. And they do it because they kind of not just have to, but I think really one of the salient aspects of this experiment was that they believed that someone else was going to be taking responsibility for the damage. Yeah. I am just doing what I'm told. I'm just following orders. And that's how I think Milgram, kind of found that, this is how we could staff death camps. It's not you that's doing it. Somebody else is taking the responsibility for it. And, Chris, you'd mentioned that there's, we wouldn't have IRB approval for something like this nowadays, but there are shows about this. There's actually a show called What Would You Do? And if you've not seen it, it's a great show because it taps into this human phenomenon of, if I were in that situation, hypothetically, here's what I would do. I wouldn't shock them. I would say, hell no, I'm not going to do that. That's ridiculous. Well, as Zimbardo would say, heroes are rare.
Yes.
And what you're going to do is what most people in that situation would do. And so I don't know if you've seen this show, What Would You Do? I just think it's fascinating because it really is kind of a recreation, but without the punishment. But in the show, you've got somebody who's so you'll, for instance, walk into the true subject of this particular episode is walks into a restaurant, and in the restaurant, everyone in there is in on it, and they just all act like they're patrons. Is just an example. They all act like they're patrons, and this person, so the person's sitting down, like say at the bar of this restaurant, and the another part of the experimenters come in. And they, one of them looks like a homeless guy, and the other person, looks like a legitimate businesswoman, whatever that, fill in the blanks of what that looks like in your mind. And she walks up with this quote unquote homeless person, says to the bartender there, hey, this guy can get whatever he wants. Here's the money for it. And then she's like, please have a meal. And she goes off, and I've got to get off to work, but God bless you. And so the only real subject in this is a guy who just happens to be sitting at the bar. Everyone else sitting at the bar is actually in on this experiment. And their sole job is to be the background to this, to be the audience that the individual looks to see, what should I do?
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you were to say to somebody, so what actually happens in this particular, episode is that the bartender, who again is in on it, says to the homeless person who's in on it, yeah, I'm not going to serve you anything. You're probably just going to buy alcohol with it. And he's like, no, sir, I just want to get some food. And this lady was nice enough to give me this money. Nah, you take your business somewhere else. You're just going to buy drugs with it. Now, if you were to see the situation and someone to say, what would you do in that situation? Well, I would say that, she just walked in here with this woman and I just saw her giving the money to the bartender. Dude, she just told you that he can get whatever he wants. And what actually happens is that people will be there and they'll look around, just like the ones in the experiment, in the Milgram's experiment, but look around at the experimenter. How do we define this situation? Do I define the situation? Is this a right thing to do? So if everyone else is sitting there going, no big deal. Yeah, whatever. I'm not going to put myself out there in that situation and be different, be the nail that gets hammered down. And so, and this is something that I see all the time in practice, which is that people say that I would do this. When I hear somebody say, here's what I would do in that situation, what I actually hear is, here's what I'd like to believe I would do in that situation. Yeah. And that's not actually what happens.
Oh, it's like Mark Wahlberg on the United flight that crashed in Pennsylvania on 9/11. If I'd been on that plane, then none of them terrorists would have. Yeah, people like that.
Here's the thing: when you see, because you're going to see a lot of examples of this, you're going to be inundated with it on a 24-hour news cycle. You're going to get this every day. Is that something happens where our blood's going to get, as the Simpsons would say, it's going to angry up the blood. Right? That's a very Abe Simpson thing to say. Just like 9 out of 10 religions fail in their first year, another Simpsons quote. But when you say, oh my God, that's ridiculous, you find yourself getting upset and frustrated because I wouldn't allow that to happen. You know what? What you would do in that situation is what everybody else on Flight 93 would have done in that situation. What you would do in the situation where a guy comes wielding an axe at you, when you're hypothetically saying, here's what I would do from the comfort of your own home, being a keyboard warrior, or having this vision that you're going to be like Mark Wahlberg, or The Rock, or whatever it is, Jason Bourne. The fact of the matter is that unless and until you are in the situation itself, under those exact pressures, you do not know how you're going to react. And that's the beauty, I think, of the Milgram experiment, is he didn't ask people, what would you do in the situation? He put them in the situation. A really great real life, it's not an experiment, but a real life example of what happened here was there's a movie called Compliance. I don't know if you've seen it, but Compliance, a great movie. And it's have you seen this?
I don't think I have. No.
Oh, you absolutely recommended viewing. In fact, in addition to Shawshank Redemption and The Descent, I just think are just recommended viewing for anybody. But Compliance is a movie about an individual is a sociopath, maybe a psychopath, I don't know him personally, but he would call up restaurants and he would say, this is, Sergeant Scott of the such and such police department, just get this person on the phone, can I talk to your manager? Manager gets on the phone and he says, we've got a report of somebody stealing from the register there, and somebody reported that. We're going to need to have you detain this person until we can get a unit there. And so what ends up happening, long story, medium length, is that, he ends up getting these people on the phone to do some pretty horrible things. And the most famous case, I think, was in Kentucky, I believe. It was a McDonald's, I think it was. And he called them up and got this manager, the store manager, to she called her fiance at the time in to keep an eye on this girl that had apparently stolen money, and then it became a drug thing, and got her to they stripped her down, got her to do jumping jacks naked. There's a couple phenomena at work there. One is sort of the foot in the door, where you incrementally up the ante. And if you believe that the individual on the other end is an authority figure, in Milgram's experiment, it's of course the doctor, the experimenter with a white lab coat. And if you've got somebody on the phone that calls you and says, yes, this is Sergeant such and such police department, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to say, no, you're not? I mean, how many of us ever get called like that? And what are you going to say? What's your badge number? Oh, 536941. I mean,
right.
Verify that, right? And so you do a little thing. And then that little thing turns out, oh, you know what? Do this. she's already there. It'd be really helpful. We're very busy down here at the station. We're going to have somebody dispatched. It's kind of a low level type of thing, but it is against the law, and this person did lose money. If you could just ask her to take off her shoes, because sometimes people hide things in there. Reasonable request, increment. And then, okay, well, if you have her search through her pockets, or do you have somebody you can trust who can come in and watch this? My husband, my fiance. Well, yeah, have him come in. I mean, you can trust him, right? And incremental until at the end, what gets across nowadays, particularly in this age of immediate gratification and clicks, we just simply do not have the attention span to pay attention for long. Mm-hmm. And so you better tell me the headline and the scary shit right away. If it bleeds, it leads. And people are like, there's no way I would ever do that. You know what? He did it to 70 restaurants. And wow. So, yeah, there's a, for any listeners who are interested in the actual, in seeing some of the stuff, there's the human behavior experiments, which is actually an educational video that was put up by Zimbardo from the prison study, where he looked at this type of stuff, and they go into depth about this. But the movie Compliance, I felt, did a really good job of walking through this. And when people watch this movie, when I had students watch this movie, they're like, damn, dude, I can see how that would happen. I still wouldn't do it. Bullshit. Yeah, you would.
Yeah, it's always aspirational, right?
Some people can't. Some people will be the hero. Some people say, no, this is not going to happen. But we tell ourselves that way more than we do it.
Mm-hmm. Well, because again, like you said, in the Milgram experiment, was 65% of the participants went all the way, and then the rest of them went nearly all the way. And I can absolutely put myself in the position of somebody who went all the way. And it's that feeling of just like, I just need to get through this. And like you said as well, somebody else is going to take the fall. I'm not going to get in trouble. That's a big part of it right there. How accountable am I going to be?
And Bart, wasn't there actually a guy or two in the video who was like, I won't be responsible for this, right?
He actually said that. He said, I'm not going to be responsible for this. Who's going to be responsible for what happens to this man? And the experimenter actually deliberately says, I'll take responsibility for it.
So that adds to it. And that really explains, I mean, when he was trying to find out why so many people did what they did under the Nazi regime, there it is right there. And how much people have to sort of erase in their minds any other distress, any other cognitive dissonance, any of that stuff. They have to just erase it.
But and that's the thing. Think about this. This is what I love about this show that we're doing, is that it's really making me kind of look at this. And I haven't looked at this, since 2005, really. But it stuck with me, and I think there's a part of it that I think that may be missing. And so one of them is that, you didn't have a whole bunch of people watching the experiment that Milgram was doing. It was in isolation. You have a person in the room, and there's another individual in the other room that's supposedly this learner, right? I think there's variations of the experiment I think would be interesting to do that wouldn't ever be done. One would be to actually have them see the person and see the physical reaction, see the pain that's going on with them. And my guess is that would reduce the number of people, or it would certainly increase the distress of the person that was delivering the shocks, if you could see the reaction of that individual. As it is, if they're not there, you kind of have this plausible deniability. You can kind of shut that off in your mind. Mm-hmm. A way of not taking, kind of acting like, well, out of sight, out of mind. The other piece I think that isn't in there, and I think that it's important for when we talk about cults, is that it's not a sunk cost. I don't know what you would call it, but I've delivered 15 volts, and then I delivered 30 volts. Well, the 15 volts, you flipped out, the guy's like, it's kind of like, oh, okay, whatever, it's kind of silly, you feel a little bit uncomfortable, right? The 30 volts, it's like, you can't tell, but if you look at my screen, the decibels went up a little bit. But you get to you're going to now you're going to then 45 and then 60, and it's getting increasing. Now you've already administered 15, you've already administered 30. You've already, at some part of your executive functioning, is essentially justifying that was okay. Mm-hmm. 15 was okay. 30 was okay. 45, I guess that's okay. And then you start to look, whoa, this is starting to get a little bit more. What do I do? And so I think that if you have in an environment where somebody says, wait, this is wrong, we shouldn't be giving all our money to this person, we shouldn't be giving all our power to them. If you can publicly cut them off at the knees, then it makes it much less likely that anybody else is going to speak up. And it allows that incremental takeover to occur. There's so many things about that experiment which were, and it's unfortunate we can't really do it much anymore nowadays, but that are so seminal and so relevant.
Right. Chris, now you mentioned too that what are some of the replications that differed later on?
Like any good psychologist, Milgram did he played with some of the variables and said, okay, well, what if this? Well, what if this? So he's like, hey, this was done at Yale. People were coming to Yale. What if we take it off site? It's in just some like nondescript building downtown or whatever. Okay, what if the experimenter doesn't wear a lab coat? So that's not a signal of professional, I am the person in control. What if there's two teachers working together? So he really played with a lot of different variables, but the results were pretty much the same. Oh, and the other thing too, they were all men in the original study. And so in other studies, I don't know if any of them were all women, but definitely women were included in different variations of that study. But really the results did not vary that much. Some of them did have an effect, to Bart's point. I don't know, actually, that's a great one. I don't know if there was a variable where they could see the person, react or something like that. I can't remember if that was one of them, but in total, it was over 600 participants who were studied across those 18 variations. And again, the results were still consistent.
The point to take from this in relation to cults is that you can end up part of an organization that seems very benign and very good and very positive and affirming. And in fact, one of the things that makes a cult seem so affirming in the beginning is this process called love bombing. That is where they will just pile on the adoration and the acceptance and they give you this feeling that you are adored, that you are desired, that you are wanted. And if you are coming from a place where you are lacking that, then you are incredibly susceptible. But once you are in that group and you are under that leadership, then when they start asking you to do things and they start expecting more and more from you, then it is a human tendency, as has been established by this experiment, among others, that you will follow along. That it's really hard not to. You are not a special person for following. In fact, it's the person, the rare person that said, oh, fuck this, I'm noping on out of here. I'm not pushing any buttons. I mean, did anybody refuse to push a button once they were in there? No, everybody's pushing a button. It's really about how many buttons you're willing to push before you get out. And for most of these people, they aren't. In fact, every one of us, anybody listening to this, the three of us right here engage in this process every single day just to function in a society. We are pushing buttons every day that we are told to push. Pay your bills, follow the speed limit, don't murder people. I mean, all these things.
That one's bullshit, by the way. I'm just going to put that out there. I think,
and we don't even have somebody right over our heads or somebody in a lab coat giving an order or to not do something. We are doing these things without that. I mean, admittedly, we are accountable in some way. If we don't pay our bills, then we're the ones sitting in the dark like a bunch of dorks. But, there is this whole thing of like, we are in an obedient form.
I think people need rules. They don't want to admit it, most people really do want to know what the rules are. And most people, in my experience, I've worked in prisons for 20 plus years and in several of them. And I can tell you that, it's kind of like kids. Kids don't want to be restricted, and yet they know they need to be. It's an interesting phenomenon, right? And so the hope with most people is that you live in a society where you internalize the rules, and by internalize, I don't just mean I'm going to get punished for this, but I mean there's sort of an intrinsic value to being law abiding. I mean you're a light at 2:00 in the morning. You can see a mile in every direction. There's no one there. The light's red. Why don't you just run the light? And I mean, some people do. Most people don't.
Right.
Even if you were to say, what are the chances there's going to be a cop there? Well, it's very little because I could see him coming. But we've internalized that so much that even if you kind of drill down into the granular level of, okay, what are the chances really that the cops can be? Well, maybe there's a cop that's actually hanging out by Fujiyama and just waiting for people to come to this light and run through it. How fucking ridiculous of a rationalization is that? But the fact of the matter is that we follow those rules because we live the next day. Whatever it is that we're doing gets us to the next day, right? And so Monday turns into Tuesday, turns into Wednesday, turns into 20 years of doing this. And your brain, your neurons, your internal structure has kind of come a long line, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the things that I'm curious to see as this podcast is going to, I think, elucidate, is as we get into more and more distance from each other physically and less currency of human interaction. I really think that's one of the big problems we're running into is certainly in my life, is that I've actually seen some of these. I get these flyers in the mail all the time for, here's a training in dialectical behavior therapy, or here's a training on how to deal with anxious clients, whatever. And then I saw one the other day that was how to talk to people, literally. So there's some licensed social worker that is giving a talk for $450. You can go to this talk and learn how to talk to people. And I'm like, I'm looking through this description. I'm like, holy crap! It's like people just don't, in many cases, know how to just interact with people. And I don't just mean small talk, but I think that as we get, we have so much access to our own echo chambers. We seek validation. We seek some specialness in our life because we see out there that we are just, in many cases, just grinding through, barely making it day to day. And, it's disheartening for one thing. And so I think that to be able to feel like you're part of something special, something that makes you, have an impact on the world, that you can actually be someone. I think that we're going to see a whole lot more of that. And I think the definition of cult is going to probably broaden a bit, or we're going to see more of this,
It really needs to. And in fact, cults have been around, of course, for centuries. This is, not a new thing, but in the 20th century, I would say that the 70s, the 60s and the 70s, through the 90s, I should say, that middle part, that of the 20th century, once you see the rise of counterculture and a lot of things that branched off from that, and political unrest and economic turmoil and all these, it was just, we've been jumping from one shit show to another in a cultural sense for the last 50 years, especially. And it's continuing to evolve as we go. But I really think that that's when those cults really started to find one another. That's when they really started to form around something, and people needed that extra identity. It's like, well, if we're shedding these rigid societal roles of woman, stay home, cook all day, raise kid, while husband go out, work all day, that dynamic, once we get rid of that, which I am not saying that's the dynamic we need to have, but I think once we got rid of that rigid, binary system, and we started to say, hey, we can do other things, we sort of became this like miasma of uncertainty and all these other possibilities and identities, and we don't know what's right or wrong. And so everybody's just trying to find a place in the chaos that like feels like they belong in. And, we're still figuring that out. And if anything, it is getting harder. I want to talk about the Stanford prison experiment, because this is more about the way people behave in given roles, and whether it could go against your inner nature. Like if you say, put on a prison guard uniform, at what point do you start behaving like a guard? And if you put on a prison inmate uniform, at what point do you start to act like the inmate, act like somebody who is oppressed, act like somebody who is under the thumb of a hardened guard? And that's what Philip Zimbardo in Stanford in 1971, he assembled a prison in the basement of the building at Stanford. It made an actual prison. Didn't he actually like have the inmates arrested?
Yeah, he did. He did.
By real police, right?
Yeah, he did. He had the police go in and arrest them. They brought them down. They booked them and fingerprinted them. All that. So it was, part of that is exactly what you're talking about, Allie, which is that the trappings of the idea of what a criminal goes through or what it looks like. And so they start off with this that's not indoctrination, but they start off with these, if you just slap on a uniform to someone, it's a little bit harder to get into that role. But if you go through the steps of, police are arresting you at your place of work or in your class, because these were all students. Actually, I met Zimbardo last year.
Oh, did you really? Oh,
I did. Yeah, I met him. I was at a conference in Oregon, and he was there. It was a Western Psychological Association conference.
Does he still have epic facial hair? I just want to get that.
Yeah, I have a picture of me and him together. I'll send you that. I'll see if I can. Give me a second. I'll find my phone. I'll see if I can send you a picture. Hold on.
He got all these people together in this prison or fake prison, and this took place. It was supposed to take place for a month, right? I think it was supposed to be 2 weeks. 2 weeks, and it didn't even make a week.
Didn't make a week. It made 6 days. I think
6 days, because what ended up happening was the situation quickly descended into a sort of pandemonium. The people who were the guards, that were in the role of the guards, were starting to become very abusive. They were starting to become very, high on their own sense of power and the freedom they were given to push the inmates around and strip them down and humiliate them. This study has actually been used to explain why, for instance, Abu Ghraib happened, the atrocities there during the Gulf War. Or the Iraq War, when they found all those pictures of the soldiers torturing a lot of the prisoners, piling them up and making them do poses and all this. In fact, even though this study took place many decades before that incident took place, and immediately recalled oh, okay, because you are given this total freedom in this role to behave this way, you're put in the right environment to do it, and you don't have accountability. So you're going to behave in a certain way. And as the inmate, you're going to respond in a way that is very like an abused person would respond. Most people under that situation tend to curl up. They shrink. They don't fight back. They get despondent. They get depressed. They get kind of like, they just go along. They sort of become drones in a sense.
Like the Milgram experiment, it didn't start off with when you put these uniforms on, because what happened was they randomly assigned them. These are people that were normal individuals, right? Relatively normal. I mean, at the time, Stanford, in California, some of them have used pot, whatever, at the time, which is not a big deal. They were so ahead of their time, but there was no notable pathology for anybody. Relatively intelligent and normal, non-pathological individuals, and they were literally randomly assigned. Your guard, your prisoner, your guard, your prisoner, and so both sides knew from the beginning that they had every bit as much of a chance of being in a guard or being a prisoner. They both knew that, like, the guards in the beginning knew the prisoners hadn't done anything wrong. They knew that it was just a flip of a coin that
right.
ended up on the side of the guards, right? And early on, as with the Milgram experiment, whereas with Milgram, you have people that are kind of hesitantly looking back at the experiment or going, there was an awkwardness with accepting that role. And the same type of thing happened in the Zimbardo experiment, is that there was a level of discomfort and kind of awkwardness of, how do we really proceed? And it early on, it seemed like this experiment's just going to be a bust. They're not going to accept these roles. And what happened was that one of the guards started to decide, I'm going to go ahead and take on this role, and he started to be a little bit more severe, or making people follow these rules. Because what they said in this thing is, so first of all, the prisoners had to be there over 24/7. They were there overnight. The guards got to go home. The prisoners didn't just wear, they had smocks, right? They had their personal clothes taken away. They're given a number to remind them of their lack of or loss of identity. And that's what actually happens in prisons, right? Except on visitation day, you're in prison garb. You're constantly reminded you don't have individuality. They also had, as I recall, like a lock, like a chain and a lock around their ankle as sort of a constant physical reminder. And so what ended up happening was that it shifted after the first day or so. The prisoners were like, they only had to follow, I can't remember how many, it was like 6 rules. Like you had to finish all of your meal, and you had to address the guards as Mr. Correctional Officer. You couldn't address them by any other name or whatever. And there were whatever these other rules were, you had to follow them. And the guards started to think about the prisoners as actually being dangerous. And once they started to think, these people are actually, they could be dangerous, they could be a problem, then that helped to solidify their own role of, all right, I got to maintain order. And, that when they're not given a clear direction about what is it you're supposed to do as a correctional officer, what are the ethics behind that? One of the things that I say all the time to people is that people come to prison as punishment, not for punishment.
Right.
And I really think it's important to let that sink in, that when people go to prison, that's the punishment itself, being taken away from your family and losing your liberty, and, somebody going through and finding your search history on your computer you haven't had a chance to erase, all kinds of horrible consequences, right? And you have a felony record and all this type of stuff. But when they start to view you as being dangerous, then the natural reaction for those inmates is, hey, I haven't done anything wrong, fuck you. And they start to resist. They're like, I've done nothing wrong. This is bullshit. And the thing was that nobody ever told the guards, don't do this. And so the guards went into, they started to become more, I guess sadistic, but certainly more cruel and inventive with their punishments. They do things like, for instance, they would make the prisoners, like if somebody's cell wasn't clean, it's one of the things you have to keep your cell clean. One of the prisoner's cells wasn't clean. He decided, I'm not playing along with this. This is bullshit. I'm not doing this. This is stupid. This is an experiment, whatever. And the guards made the other inmates, the other prisoners, chant, prisoner, whatever, 213 is not following the rules, or he's causing us. They get these chants. They were saying this person's not, his cell is not in order, and therefore we're responsible for this. Whatever, I can't remember exactly what it was. I'll find there's probably an audio clip of it somewhere. But they would make these, and the other prisoners were like, all right, I'll go ahead and chant this. It doesn't mean anything. We all know it's not true. But that one prisoner who was being targeted started to really feel literally targeted and overwhelmed. And there was an emotional, just overwhelming emotional breakdown with him. And there's I think a critical point where you reach where you've now defined these two groups. And once they're better defined, and you are in group A and you're in group B, you're a guard, you're a prisoner, then if you don't have real clear guidelines on what you're supposed to do, you revert to how you think that role acts. So where do you learn about prison? Well, you learn about prison from TV. If you haven't been to prison before, TV sensationalizes that. So the guards are all going to be, like Shawshank Redemption, right? Like you're going to be beating the prisoners and raping them. And does that happen? Yes, it does. Does it happen with the level of frequency? Well, I don't know that that's necessarily the case. It certainly does happen. But I mean, that was the thing about this, is that, Zimbardo himself was supposed to be the warden. Yes. He was the one, and he was just watching this, and he's like, wow, look at all, he's all fascinated.
That's the thing. He got so caught up in it that he had to be told, you need to get this shit under control because you're losing control of this thing. And he was when he talks about this, he even talks about how, in retrospect, disturbed he was by his own engagement and loss of self in this situation.
He says specifically, the situation changed me. They're looking at me as the warden. I became essentially what his internal representation of warden was, which was sit back and make sure that order is being kept there. And he didn't think about what was happening to these people who had done nothing. Right. And I don't know how, I don't even know what his idea was about what the end game of this experiment was going to be. It certainly seems that if he didn't recognize that people could have a really incredibly negative emotional reaction to it, that he wasn't really thinking. Right. And if he did think that was going to happen, the question is, for me, at what point was his failsafe where he would step in there and go, this is too much? And that didn't happen. It didn't happen until, actually, I think one of his researchers, female researcher, came to his fiance or something. His fiance, yeah. It might have been. They came in and said, what the hell? She's coming in as an outsider. But that's the thing. You come in as an outsider, you see this prison, you see this cult, and you go, oh my God. But the phenomenology that goes on that leads to it is it's incremental, and it relies on us taking shortcuts. That's what the situation does.
This study, I think, really, the Milgram study is essential to understanding the human behavior behind obedience and following orders. However, this study to me is such an important microcosm of understanding how authoritarian systems are developed and how quickly they can actually develop. And also, that is what a cult essentially is. You need that authoritarian dynamic in order for it to work and hold itself together. Going back to that charismatic leader again, or in Zimbardo's case, the sort of like, I'm just going to hold court while, this happens and they know I'm here. But in the meantime, that's where abuse is set in. That's why in a lot of cults you see, sexual abuse happening a lot of emotional abuse, a lot of gaslighting, a lot of kind of behaviors that make the followers, as you say, depersonalize themselves, de-individualize themselves, become part of that collective. And this study really emphasizes, again, to reiterate, 6 days out of a 14
Well, I guess I
day.
want to ask a question of both of you then, and it's for the listening audience too, is Zimbardo's experiment. A movie I'm big on movies. A movie I would recommend is Das Experiment.
The German film.
If you're okay reading subtitles, it's Zimbardo hates it. He thinks it makes him look, but this Zimbardo's experiment was stopped. So what if it hadn't been stopped?
Right.
What if it had gone on not for 2 weeks? What if it had gone on, well, just hypothetically, what the hell? What if it had gone on for 6 months? With how it was going. Because what had happened was people would say, I can't do this, get me out of this experiment. And they let him out of the experiment. They said, okay, you're going to, and so one by one, you have a lot of these people that are just leaving the experiment. Well, what if it were like prison?
Mm-hmm.
What if it were like a cult and you can't leave? Then where does it go from there? I mean, did it get sexual? Did they actually start to, because that's really where a lot of this goes, is it gets into the hangups that people have, the shame that they have about sexuality and sex in general.
Mm-hmm.
That if it had gone for 6 months and they hadn't been allowed to lead the experiment, what would it look like? Because sooner or later, if those prisoners had started to rebel, the guards would have to put that rebellion down.
I would say anybody who's interested in understanding these two foundational psychological studies, that yes, they do have their drawbacks. They do have their imperfections, their little nits you can pick. Absolutely. However, a lot of this stuff you can see in the wider world. It's when we're talking about the formation of cults, whenever we talk about terrorism, which is another cult, for instance, why people follow along, why somebody straps a bomb to their body. That is, again, the result of the sort of thought conditioning that happens in a cult-like setting. And that is completely, again, separate from the religion, the mainline religion. I want to reiterate this. I am not coming after Islam. I am not coming after Mormonism. I am coming after the extremist offshoots of those things. And I'm not coming after religion in general, because there is a distinction. People want to be very glib about religion and cults, and they want to conjoin the two. Oh, what's the difference really? They point to the Vatican and all this. And look, I am not going to defend the Vatican. But what I will say is that there is a distinct difference between a religion and a cult. Usually the religion does not force you to completely isolate yourself from non-believers or people who don't or who aren't part of that organization. They aren't, again, holding your whole life and livelihood over your head if you choose to leave. They are not usually, again, I'm not going to mention the Vatican too much. They're usually not sexually abusing you, but people want to intermingle the two terms like they're the same. And I think that's dangerous. I think we really need to distinguish between the two, because it might be easy if you're an atheist sitting there going, oh, they all suck, and you want to just sweep them under the rug. But you need to be able to distinguish between, say, a a Jim Jones type character or somebody who's a member of these cults from, the fact that your grandma goes to church every Sunday. It's not the same. Your grandma can go to church every Sunday and not be part of a cult. Also, you need to be able to recognize when somebody actually is in a cult, because those are people that need rescuing and intervention.
And one important, maybe end cap for these two studies that I think is important, and I think it relates to cults too, is the presence or absence, if you will, of an authority figure.
Yes.
In Milgram, as we've stated, there is an authority figure running everything. What happened in Zimbardo's study is he was there, but he wasn't restraining any behavior. And therefore that left the participants to kind of fill in the gaps and often go off of their perception of what they think a prison guard should do based off of movies. Or I think one of the participants later was like, yeah, I kind of leaned into I was in theater and I kind of leaned into my theater background to make it a performance. And when they were doing that and they were not being reprimanded or stopped by this authority figure, Zimbardo, the warden, that just reinforced the behavior. And so I think they're really interesting kind of pairing of studies, because while that's not, I think, what Zimbardo struck out for, he was going to say, if I create this simulated situation, that will affect people's behavior, not their personality. It's like, like Bart said, I didn't find a bunch of, sadistic people and put them here, or a bunch of like God-fearing Christians and put them in there. I took a random sample of folks and their personalities don't matter. But I think it almost became a little bit more about, I know I'm being watched and I'm looking at this authority figure and they're not saying I shouldn't do this. And I think this is what a prison guard would do. And I just think that those could have some interesting tie-ins or implications when we talk about these different cults throughout the season.
When you talk about the authority figure who sits back while bad actors behave badly, the person who has the ability to put this stuff down, stands up in front of people and says, there are some very fine people on both sides. And what that does is it tells the person who's behaving badly, well, he didn't tell me that I was doing a bad thing, so I'm just going to keep doing it. It's that implied encouragement, because you can be an authority figure by either being the iron fist, constantly striking down, or like you said, just kind of, not, stopping the bad behavior. It kind of results in a similar outcome.
Something I'm curious about too is about the mob mentality that happens. I imagine, talking about that at some point in the future, but once you have in your mind the idea that this is the thing that I need to do, this is a right thing to do, I'm going to, in your example, take back the presidency, or going to storm the Capitol, whatever, that as with some religions, you're very there's a tendency to be really fast and loose with your interpretation of that authority figure and what that authority figure says and what they mean and what their texts say and mean. Literally texts, I guess. So there's the actual biblical text, and then there's the tweeting text, which is the shorthand nowadays. I kind of imagine if that leader, once the momentum has occurred and you kind of feel like I've got this purpose and everything like that, and this feels right, this feels valid, I am special again, I have purpose and meaning. Once that cat's out of the bag, I don't know that there's a lot that the leader could do, because the leader says, don't do it. You have your own sort of cognitive dissonance you have to deal with, which is, well, wait a minute. On the one hand, I believe this person to be all knowing, all powerful, all charismatic. It's, everything that I want them to be. And that person wouldn't ever tell me to stop. And yet this person is telling me to stop. So how do you resolve that dissonance? Well, one is to say, it's not what he means. It's not what he means.
Yes.
This is just all the more evidence that this is not what that person means. And it just allows you to dig in further, because the alternative is to say, well, crap, I'm wrong. And you lose your identity there. And that, I think, is the most terrifying thing for most people, whether they're aware of it or not.
You created a beautiful segue, because I do want to talk about that. That was after laying down these studies and talking about, those various foundations, getting into cognitive dissonance. I think it is like the key ingredient in this stew that makes it all possible. That practice of cognitive dissonance. And what is that exactly? We throw that word around. That's like a $10 term almost that gets tossed around. And I think a lot of people don't stop to think what it is. But what, in fact, is cognitive dissonance? I'm going to let a psychologist explain it. Be you, Bart.
You said you weren't going to put me on the spot.
Well, okay. So I will guide this, since I guess I'm the host of this stupid show. No. So say that somebody's telling you one thing that goes against what you already believe in your head.
Well, how about this? I've heard the earth is flat. I've been told forever the earth is flat. And then suddenly someone comes along and says, no, the earth is round.
Yeah. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
Are you going to believe the guy who says that the earth is round? That thing that, goes against everything you've been hearing, your entire life. Like your dad told you the earth was flat, and your dad took you to baseball games, and you love your dad, and you're, and everything that your dad ever said was just spun gold, and then somebody comes along and not only tells you that the earth is round, but they start showing you ways that the earth is round. And they, all those fun little experiments, that they can do to show you the curvature of the earth and, all that sciencey stuff. Well, you don't want to accept the science, because that means you would have to adjust your entire worldview that's been shaped for you by your awesome dad who told you the earth was flat. And what do? Now, you could accept that science. You could be like, oh, wow, maybe dad didn't know that. Dad didn't go to college, but this guy did. So maybe he knows more than we know. And, oh, that's pretty cool. I guess the earth is round. Wouldn't it be awesome if people did that?
Well, yeah. I love the fact that you're using an example of a father. And I was thinking about this example. I was like hesitant to share it, but if you don't mind, I can share a personal example that I think can elucidate it. I mean, we all thought that our parents, I think many people think their parents are, they got superpowers. I heard a comedian say this one time. It's like, I thought my parents had superpowers, and then I realized their only superpower was they knew how to fuck each other. So here's an example, and it's part of what feeds my imposter complex too. But my parents were both shrinks. Right? My mom and dad met when essentially my mom was being attacked by an ape in the primate lab at MIT, and so I have an older brother who has essentially more or less disowned me, but he's 14 months older than me. And so he and I grew up with my, viewing my parents as being, scholarly and intelligent and successful. And, they really, it's like, wow, they know what they're talking about. They were very, very well respected. And my brother grew up, as did I, with the idea that, because they both had PhDs, and it's like, wow, people with PhDs are smart and blah, 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 blah. And then, and so my brother also simultaneously is growing up with this younger brother, me, and I'm kind of a jerk. I was a brat of a kid. I was a second born. He had to go through all the crap first. And, I've always been in his eyes this sort of immature, whatever. And I get that. Right. And then I got a doctorate. Then I got a PhD. And so the two thoughts, so cognitive dissonance is really about resolving that disconnect, that discomfort between, two competing beliefs, or between your attitudes and your beliefs and things like that. And so in this case, my brother was faced with this dissonance. Either he believed, he maintained the belief that psychologists are intelligent individuals who worked hard to get where they are, and all that goes along with that. And that means that Bart is also, I guess he's intelligent. I guess he's responsible. I guess my idea of him as a irresponsible little jerk is wrong. Maybe I need to amend or change my belief. Or he maintains the belief that I am still an immature little jerk. And so what does that then do to his belief about all psychologists? Well, he has to change that belief then. If he's going to hold on to I'm an immature little shit, then that must mean he was wrong about psychologists and PhDs. I guess they aren't all that special. I guess, yeah, mom and dad's real superpower was just they knew how to fuck each other. That was it. There's nothing special about them. And then you carry that further to a belief that I just don't really think that all people who have anybody who has a PhD, I got to think twice about that. Anybody who has a doctorate or who has this specialty in this area, maybe it's, I mean, if Bart can do it, anyone can do it. And that's essentially what happens is you're faced with a belief system or an attitude or behaviors that you engage in. And something comes up to challenge that. And you have to make a decision about which one are you going to hold on to? Because you can't hold on to both of them.
Right.
They can't both be true. So something has to give.
You got to spin that reality to fit your belief that's already pre-established. Dan Cummins, host of the podcast Time Suck. Fantastic show.
Mm-hmm.
In his show where he talks about the Rajneesh cult, goes into a little bit of that in the beginning of his episode and talks about the doubling down theory. Like most people seem to, rather than try to adjust that view in a healthy way, by accepting that new information and folding it into in a healthy way that, say, elevates your view or changes it in some way, you double down on the view you already have, because it's easier than having to adjust everything that you grew up knowing or that you have established for yourself. And that whole process, we are faced with that constantly. I would say that as a species, we have never had a bigger barrage of cognitive dissonance like in front of us every day, constantly, because of all the news, all the takes that people have out there, all this information. We're just awash with so much information that as soon as we think we have it figured out, we're presented with something else. Like, is this safe? Are we allowed to like this now? Are we still allowed to like this? It's like a common thing in a conversation now. Are we allowed to talk about this anymore? Are we allowed to like this? Or have we like spun it in a way, to make it acceptable?
Life is messy, and we want it to be clean, and it's not ever going to be clean. It's not simple. It is complicated. It is nuanced. And people, again, it comes down to, I think, in part, how we consume information now. And we are drinking from the fire hose. Mm-hmm. There's just so much out there that you cannot possibly research everything. You can't really delve into, you just don't have time and energy to do that. It's just like when if you're getting on a bus and, you're not going to research every single person there and see who you're going to sit next to. You're going to use shortcuts. That's what you're going to do. And your shortcuts are going to be wrong a lot of times. You all go sit by this person who looks like a college professor. Well, it turns out that's a rapist. Yeah, who knew, right? It doesn't fit your idea of what that person should look like. I'm not going to sit by this person over here because they look dangerous or sketchy because they belong to this category of people that I don't really know, but I've got lumped in with these characteristics. And we use heuristics so much more than we use algorithms. And we use a rule of thumb, and we use shortcuts because we simply do not have or make the time to do anything more than that. And the more information we get, the more that's available out there, the more overwhelming it seems, the more impossible it seems that we're going to be able to make any sense of it and get to the right decision. And that means that ultimately we could be wrong. And people are just petrified of being wrong.
We're not going to try to resolve those conflicts anymore. You talk about that conflict, the cognitive dissonance part, and how we need to resolve that because we can't hold those thoughts at the same time. I think what ultimately happens, and what happens in a cult-like scenario, especially because you, in that environment, you are, again, presented with so much information. You have been, again, love bombed to death. You've been given all these rules, this whole new code of thinking, all these, again, the thought stopping cliches and all the language. And that's the other thing about what a cult will do. You'll get this special lingo that's part of the cult situation. So you feel like you're part of a special little thing that nobody else knows, and it makes you feel exclusive. And so you're given all this information, and rather than resolve that conflict, you're just going to pretend it doesn't exist. You're going to just say, I know what I know. Okay. And that's that. Like that's the resolved dissonance right there. And in the environment that we're in now, in the wider world with all the other information and things competing for our time and attention, absolutely. I think that we're going to continue to see an escalation of the lack of people like resolving that conflict. What they're going to do is they're just going to put themselves into a tribe that reinforces that and shut out everything else, because it's just easier to do that. rather than try to fold in other people who might be a little different or have another viewpoint, or, we're just going to shut out anybody that doesn't have this very rigid set of beliefs and behaviors. And that, in a sense, creates a cultic mindset among everybody, which is frankly dangerous and scary.
And what we haven't talked about with cognitive dissonance yet is that theory actually did come from studying cults.
Yes.
Like that's where it actually came from. So Leon, do you guys know if it's Festinger or Festinger? Do you know if it's a jur?
I would go Leon Festinger.
So Leon Festinger in 1957 developed this theory, and what he was basically looking at were cults. And he was looking at a cult that believed that the earth was going to be destroyed by a flood. We've heard of these before, right? Like the end is nigh. Right? And
doomsday cults. Yep.
Yeah. And he was looking at what happened to its members, particularly the really committed ones who had given up their homes and jobs and everything to devote themselves to this cult. And then, of course, the flood did not happen. Surprise, surprise, spoiler alerts. And what he found was like the fringe members were more inclined to recognize that they'd kind of made a fool of themselves. They invested in something that was wrong. They chalk it up to experience. These are the people that weren't fully indoctrinated. But the committed members were more likely to reinterpret the evidence to show that they were right all along. Your double down theory, idea that was that Dan was talking about on his show. The earth was not destroyed because of the faithfulness of the cult members. Mm-hmm. So their belief was, it didn't happen, but it's because we believed and we had such faith that we were able to stave off this disaster. And because, to your very point, like they've invested so much, the sunk cost fallacy we keep talking about, that is a hard pill to swallow. So it's much easier just to be like, you know what, let's think about this a different way. And to your point, Allison, we can see that happening a lot with modern day cults. You mentioned QAnon.
Oh,
there are multiple predictions about things that are going to happen that don't, but they just get reinterpreted. How many times
is Trump supposed to be reinstated as president over the last 2.5 years? I've lost count, but there's been a date.
Or JFK's alive still, or JFK Jr., is alive still. And, there's all sorts of things that are believed that when I think people even showed up for JFK Jr. to reappear, and I think be Trump's running mate, if I remember correctly. Clearly that didn't happen. But I can guarantee you, nobody was like, wow, we really screwed that up.
I just thought there was just this zombie shambling around Martha's Vineyard, just, looking for the campaign spot, and they never found him.
I can guarantee you no one said that, even though I have no evidence. I'm like, nobody really said like, well, I screwed that one up. I'm such a doofus. It was more like, well, it didn't happen because, right?
You'll see the occasional black sheep stray from the flock where you have like, dude, guys, I really think it might not be happening this time. I think maybe we've been like, but is that
rare. The fringe person? Is that the fringe member who's not fully indoctrinated and fully invested?
It is absolutely that.
You know what I would love to see?
What's that?
I would love to talk to some of these folks and really find out what their dreams are. And I don't mean like aspirations. I mean like when their frontal lobe is essentially shut off and they are free to, kind of be in that unconscious world where that director that is watching everything through our eyes every day, just waiting for us to go to sleep, to go, all right, there was that moment there that I saw as a director, where this is complete bullshit. This didn't happen. And I saw you completely rationalizing it and ignoring it. Oh, we're going to have a fun movie tonight. That I wonder how much, like if somebody says, for instance, and we do I could do an entire show on that. I think me and Chris could just talk about that. And you, Allie, that our true selves, a lot of our true selves really do come out when this conscious veil is lifted, right? And so when you and dreams for me, dreams are very much just driven by emotion. And so the images that you have are really, I think that they're idiosyncratic. They're whatever our director is basically saying, all right, you want to have a dream about shame? Well, what shame look like to me? Well, shame to me looks like, walking around in public without no clothes on and that type of thing. Somebody else, shame might look like something different. If you're going to direct a movie about it, call the movie Shame, call the movie Fear, call the movie Terror, whatever. And because that's the thing, you get presented with this evidence, this information that is contrary to what you believe in. That we're supposed to that Trump is, for instance, going to be reinstated, or that this flood is going to occur. It doesn't happen. There's an emotional part of you And I don't know that that's really, it's not visible. And so that emotional part, is there a part of these individuals that in the very, very deep inside of them, it's like, oh, fuck, man, I'm wrong. And how terrifying that is. Or do they really have it so internalized that they automatically believe that, that means I'm one of that it's my faith that has led to this happening. And that I think could come out way more unconsciously. I think that comes. So if you look at somebody's dreams about what they have, if their dream is indicative of, for instance, themes of whatever it might be, of fear or doubt or, shame or all this type of stuff, if that's the feeling that's underlying those dreams, that's very telling. Different from somebody who has a dream of, feeling invincible and justified, and they have dreams that feel very powerful and validating and all this type of stuff. I would really be interested to see what it is that those people dream about.
That also leads me to want to discuss a little bit about, I think we're thinking to the dreams and the thoughts of the flock, right? The believers, the true believers, versus the leaders. Because I think there's often a stark difference. I don't always think that the leaders are true believers. I think often they're selling something. I think they start huffing their own fumes after a while. Jim Jones, I will use as an example. I mean, he started out, I think, as a pretty earnest preacher. I think in the very beginning of the founding of the People's Temple, and they were trying to build something. They had a whole social, justice type agenda, of kind of progressive, and can't be forgotten too that this was a very racially Black congregation that he had. So he had tapped into like racial equality and all these ideals, that seemed very at first like, oh, there's nothing harmful about this. But then he passed a certain point. He crossed the Rubicon, if you will, and started to really believe his own hype and his own power. And then it just kind of like festered from there, such to the point that when this all culminated down in Guyana, when the walls were closing in and he starts going on these rants about how we need to escape, we need to kill ourselves. He didn't drink his own poison. He had somebody shoot him in the head. So he got to the point where I think he knew he didn't believe. He was really just trying to murder these people and get out because he knew he was screwed. They'd killed a congressman. They knew that the hammer was about to fall on them.
Well, and if I can't have him, nobody can. There's also that element too.
Exactly. And so the cult leader, I think psychologically is quite different from the follower. And that's where I, would like to talk a little bit about narcissistic personality, because how much do you think plays into becoming a charismatic guru cult leader type? Do you think the narcissism is it already kind of wired in there, do you think? Or is it something that, over the course of this sort of repetition? Because as I mentioned before, it shows like the way you process information, and Rick Allen Ross's book goes into this a great deal, talking about the brain literally changes over time with these reinforced behaviors and thought patterns. The way that you take in information and reroute it, the way your neurons fire, they completely change over time to where you don't have the ability to process information anymore the way we might, or the way a lot of other people might. It's just that ability is no longer there. So when it comes to like the narcissism factor that makes you rise up and become this all-powerful leader, do you think that's a learned behavior? Or do you think that it's already kind of in them?
I would say it's ingrained and then reinforced. Personally, that's my feeling, because you're right. The people who join a cult are there for a sense of community, of belonging, of purpose. Often they're vulnerable. But for the leader, that's really not why they're there. They're there for a really deep need for like excessive attention and admiration. That to me is the core of it. They have an inflated sense of self, but to me, it's I need excessive attention and admiration. And that is the driving factor. And then once you get that, I think it's just self-reinforcing.
I would tend to agree. I would make a distinction between what I would consider to be more organic narcissism and acquired narcissism. And so there's only 10 personality disorders, and they're divided up into 3 clusters, right? So cluster B, which is sometimes called cluster F, the one that's the dramatic cluster: histrionic, antisocial, narcissistic, and borderline.
Yeah.
And so, with that dramatic presentation, so personality disorder is defined as being a way of processing and seeing and understanding the world that's really firmly entrenched by the time you're an adult, by the time you're 18. You can't really diagnose personality disorders with somebody younger than that. You can certainly see traits or characteristics of it, but is it a genetic neurological predisposition? No, I don't think so. I think that there's what I would call a diathesis stress model. I would say that there's some predispositions that some people, if they experience the right situations, are more likely to develop that. And I think that what you see with people who are narcissistic is such a core level of insecurity that is this almost reaction formation, that what they form as a defense against that feeling of being completely adrift and lost and
You're
insecure.
pulling out the Freud. I like it.
Yeah, well, I mean, Freud, for all the coke he did, he had a couple things right. He had unconscious drivers, and he had dreams. I think he had those right. I think he did well with the defense mechanisms. Then he kind of went off a little bit too far on, the pizza delivery, mommy boy issues. Yeah, that type of stuff. But still. But I think that, when you look at the clusters, the cluster B, which there is developmentally, what's happening is that, that the experiences that they have early in life, they for all of us, they determine kind of which direction we're going to go. And if we have buffers against becoming a particular way, like if we're naturally predisposed to be more narcissistic or whatever, however you arrive at that conclusion, then you may not fully manifest it. And then you have other individuals that, because they've been there's a lot of, political figures, for instance, that you can imagine that haven't ever had to earn anything their entire life, that they have always been told that they're special as a stand-in for actually doing anything worthwhile or anything of value. And so they don't really know, they don't experience they don't experience value as we know it, as most people know it. And so they see other people around them that are experiencing this type of organic satisfaction and intrinsic motivation, things like that. And they themselves are just like, they don't have that. And so whether that's actually kind of chronically genetically missing from them, or if it's something that's just not ever reinforced enough, so that, again, Monday turns into Tuesday, turns into Wednesday, turns into 18 years old, turns into 30 years old, turns into 50 years old. And so there's a sort of a level of, I think, acquired narcissism that happens when people are in positions of power. And so you may start off with something that even is a noble idea,
right?
And actually maybe even altruistic in nature. I don't believe there's any such thing actually as true altruism, but, altruistic, underpinnings. And then once you start to get to power, and that feeds something in you, and then that becomes something you want more of. And then it becomes, the narcissism becomes instrumental. Because what narcissism is about, not being able to feel empathy and being exploitative of other individuals, and believing that you are destined for greatness and power and should only surround yourself with the greatest, most powerful, most influential people, and all this type of stuff, which is window dressing. And so, and at the core of narcissism is this fear of being discovered for being an imposter, for being inadequate, for being, inferior. And that's why when people are challenged in a way, you see this with Jim Jones, if you see some of the videos of in Guyana where, that somebody's challenging him by just passively challenging him, not following the rules, that challenges his feeling of specialness. And they respond with what's called narcissistic rage. It's an injury to their narcissistic core. And it's really difficult to recover from something like that. And so I think that it's hard to tell if somebody was, narcissistic to begin with, and then they gravitate toward this, or if there are some situations in which a person gets into a position of power and influence and becomes drunk on that, and then it becomes like that narcissism kind of develops from that. But true narcissistic personality disorder is going to be pretty firmly entrenched, has to be by definition, by the age of 18, by the time you reach adulthood. So how it's manifested is different. You have people who are sociopaths and psychopaths out there who, if they find the right job, are quite successful. For somebody who doesn't give a shit about other people and they can exploit them, you can be very, very successfal in the right business. And then
aren't a lot of politicians suspected to be like potential sociopaths?
Yeah, there's. I mean, I think that there's a level of. We have a something called the PCL, the psychopathy checklist, designed by Hare, and you would probably see it divides people up into actually kind of two different types of psychopaths, very oversimplistically speaking, but I think you would find that with many people who are in positions of power, politicians or CEOs,
yeah.
Yeah, Oprah Winfrey, she's definitely a sociopath, if not a psychopath. I don't think she's a psychopath, but I think that that in order to get to those positions, you have to really be okay with dismissing the suffering of others.
I mean, look at Steve Jobs and his story of his daughter. I mean, that that guy was, yeah.
Well, I mean, but it's what we reward them with. And again, that there's a difference between the outward behavior and what somebody does and an actual personality disorder that they might suffer from. And I don't know that it may be splitting hairs, but to call somebody narcissistic for me as a psychologist is going to be, okay, well, are we talking about narcissistic personality disorder, or are we talking about the traits of narcissism, and particularly the traits that are most effective? And so if you really believe that you are special and deserving of adoration and praise, then you will find people who are going to give that to you. You are going to feed on that, and it's going to reinforce it for you. And then you're going to be avoiding people who are or denigrating or insulting or alienating people who are not providing that for you. And some people are successful at it, and some people are not. Some people are just assholes.
And some people form cult. They have a really good sense of bringing people together and organizing them and manipulating them in certain ways. They understand how systems work.
You mentioned about being a charismatic leader. And I think that that's really important, is that, people that can feel like, hey, this person gets me. They're genuine. They're really seeing me for who I am, or more importantly, for the potential of who I can be. And they are valuing that, and they're going to make me help, essentially what Massa would call, get me to self-actualization. They would use those terms, but that this is somebody who's really going to bring out the most in me. And that is intoxicating. And that is, you want to believe in that. And some people, again, everyone's on kind of a spectrum, right? So there's some people who are like, I absolutely do not believe any of that crap. And if you even come at me with something that's going to be validating for me, I'm going to think you're up to something. Okay, call them paranoid, right? And you have the opposite, which really seek that out, and they need it. And they become so needy that anybody who will provide it for them will do. And so when you look at the kind of person that's going to be susceptible to cults, that it's victimology, that what we look at in forensics and from a criminal psychology perspective is taking a look at how do we choose our victims, or how do not me, I know how to choose mine, but how is it that
I don't know. You did earlier say murder shouldn't be illegal. So I'm just not to cast too much of a spotlight on you, but
I said it was a bullshit law. Is what I said.
There is a reason Bart is on a show called Ding Dong Darkness Time. He was summoned here.
Right.
He was summoned by the bell. He stepped through the door. But no, these are all such good points, and understanding, I think, what makes a leader and how they can have cultish, again, to use the word coined by Amanda Montell, whose book I mentioned earlier, fantastic book, because she does a great job of differentiating between like an actual organized destructive cult that is a cult and somebody who behaves like a cult, which is why she coined the term cultish, because it doesn't always mean you're in a cult. That's why MLMs, to bring those up again, it's not a cult per se, but it is very cultish. And there are a lot of groups that I'm going to discuss later on in the season that have all the flavors in place. They haven't been baked all the way. It's like a cake batter that's just, you just put it in the pan. It just hasn't been completely solidified in place, but it's gonna be a cake when you pull it out of the oven. That's what a lot of these groups are. They're just
add enough of the culty twat to it and mix it in.
And I think similarly, and Bart mentioned this as well, just to kind of, I think, reinforce it, is on a similar sense, often we'll talk about oh, someone's a narcissist or whatever. And there is that differentiation that he's talking about with a clinical diagnosis that's an actual personality disorder that really only a trained professional is able to, based off the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, the DSM, is able to do that. It's kind of the person who's like, oh, I'm really OCD. And it just means that they like to clean their house versus I actually have real diagnosed obsessive compulsive disorder.
No idea what OCD really is.
Right.
It's again, that shorthand that people love.
Yeah. But I think we, throughout this season as well, we might talk about someone like, oh, they're this or they're that, talking about something that might be a colloquial term versus a clinical diagnosis. And it's just a good thing to remember to differentiate if that does come up.
Chris, I'm really glad you brought that up because it's a cue for me to kind of reel it in myself because, it is a shorthand. And we do understand when we're talking about, the guy's narcissistic. You don't need to know the 7 criteria, or the 4 or 7 criteria. That's not the point, right? Yeah. But the point is, what is it that's narcissistic about him? What are you really talking about? And if our shorthand understanding is that this is somebody who just does not care about anybody else, thinks they're so special and is exploitive of other people, all right, I'll give you, that's fine. That's fine. And if we want to delve into, is that the actual, because OCD bring that up. I'm like, God, that drives me nuts. And that example you gave is exactly what, oh my God, I'm OCD. I'm like, dude, you have no clue how terrible OCD is. But I'm not going to be like, I don't want to be like, I can't deny anybody the, using those words because it's slipped into common parlance because it's relatable.
Yeah.
It really is.
That's a very good point. And again, another word that has slipped into common parlance is brainwashing. We use it so much that we don't really give it a whole lot of thought in terms of what it actually means.
Yeah, I think brain shitting would be a better term for some of this.
I mean, there's nothing being washed. That's being filthed right up. But the whole term, of course, I think, it was coined, I believe, in 1950. It's not that new of a term, but the whole idea being that everything that you do whenever you're part of a cult or some group is a result of having been brainwashed into doing it. And unfortunately, people then will use things like, like Elizabeth Smart or Patty Hearst or some of these other like kidnapping cases where something like Stockholm syndrome developed, or in Patty Hearst's case, she really did kind of start to take on a lot of the thought processes of her captors, the Symbionese Liberation Army. And she participated in several crimes with them. And but she was kidnapped. She was brought into this, and it took time. It took work. It took, a lot of, it's almost like the process of erosion or, water shaping rock over time to form the Grand Canyon. This isn't something that just happens. There isn't like a one single magic trick that just wipes the brain clean and whoops, suddenly you're like an Etch-a-Sketch that's like blank and ready to be, redrawn. Like it doesn't work that way. And a lot of the research that I did into cults inside out, they said the researchers have hypothesized, and in many instances confirmed, is that the human mind is far more fragile, persuadable, and malleable than we would like to think, especially when people are in a state of distress or depression, are experiencing hardships, or are passing through major transition phases in their lives. They are typically more vulnerable to persuasion and other techniques of those who offer appealing answers and seemingly a way out of their difficulties. Who among us cannot be described in one of these instances? I think we're all in some form of fragility, being persuadable or malleable in some way, vulnerable. I think on a daily basis.
At some point in your life, we are all, except for people who are really psychopaths and just, we are all in that position at some point in our lives, and many, many points for some of us. And I think that's the thing to keep in mind, is that it brings it back to what we were talking about before, which is that don't say, I wouldn't be susceptible to a cult. It's that I'd like to believe that I wouldn't be.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact of the matter is that they work, they're not just going around, randomly kidnapping. The SLA, the Symbionese Liberation Army, is definitely an example of an exception. But we are all they fulfill a need.
Right. And you were making a choice. I mean, that's the thing too, is that you have to make that first step, right? If you're in a shitty place in your life and somebody comes to you with an offer that appeals to something that already is part of your intrinsic like bias, it like appeals to that. Like, say somebody came to me in the set, if I were alive back in the early 70s or whatever, and asked, oh, we're forming this church. It's all about racial equality, and we're going to build churches and help pay people's bills. I mean, that's what Jim Jones was doing. He was paying people's power bills. He was doing all kinds of stuff that like seemed at the time very rooted in good stuff. Things that I personally, that would appeal to my value system. On the other hand, if I were, say, kind of a racist, I mean, maybe we're all kind of a racist, but I mean, you know what I mean? If I were like a white supremacist, let's say, or if I were, already had these other kind of like ugly biases, and there was a group that was coming along that would say, hey, join this group or we're going to make sure the whites remain in power. And you're feeling kind of down on your luck. It's because, this population over here they're all behind it, name any minority, put it in there. And that's already appealing to something that's already lived in the back of your mind your whole life, that was built over many, many years. And you find like a freedom and an acceptance in this group. And like, you're going to finally solve your problems by joining a group that appeals to this aspect of your nature that was already there. And you made that choice to take the first step. And from that point on, that's when I think the thought reform techniques and all that stuff kind of take place to solidify your place in that group and keep you there. But you weren't brainwashed to become a white supremacist just overnight. That just doesn't happen. It was already kind of there in some way, shape, or form. Maybe you weren't a virulent racist, but maybe you found yourself constantly using the N-word inside your head, or maybe you found, oh, the Mexican took my job, just some of those little offhand remarks that people make, casual racism. And then you find like an accepted place where you can be more open about that and let that anger and that fear out of you. And that's where I think, quote unquote, brainwashing comes into effect. You were effectively encapsulated in this group through a long period of time of reinforcement within that group, of them saying it's okay to feel this way, you're accepted here, you are at home here. And that's the cycle. And that's where the brainwashing really, I think, comes into effect. But you have to have your own agency to take that first step. It has to be a choice that you make. It's like saying like you were hypnotized to kill someone. Right. That doesn't happen. You kind of, the desire to kill someone is probably already there. Like you're just ready to go. Well,
I think the initial thing is, I read this, the attractive offer of the cult. And that's kind of what you're talking about. There's something that's attractive because it kind of fits into a belief system that you have. Racial equality, helping people in need. Sign me up. Hell yeah. Or I believe in, white supremacy. Yeah, I want to double down on that. And what often makes people then stay are the dependencies. So like the attraction gets you in and then you become dependent. It's almost like addiction where you become either psychologically or physically dependent on not necessarily a drug, though drugs are often involved in some of these cults, but not all of them. But you might just have a psychological dependence on the leader, or an emotional or mental dependency on them. And so often it's the dependency then that will keep people kind of locked in. And I think that's where you see probably, as people fall into that state, you're talking about how like the brain kind of reorders itself, because it's, your brain will, your neurons will kind of, the synaptic connections will, if they're used more, they get reinforced. If they're not used, the brain tries to, eventually prune those away. A brain's ultimately about efficiency. And so anything that gets reinforced, those connections strengthen, and anything that isn't, those connections might eventually kind of dissipate. And that's probably where this brainwashing or reprogramming or whatever that terminology is taking place. Dr. Bart, did I get a B- on that?
you, I think that's perfect. Yes. I think
these are degrees, man.
You're tapping into my imposter
or did I fail with a C-? I don't know.
No,
I'm still giving myself a C- for this podcast today.
So I wonder about the term brainwashing in terms of, what we're doing, where they're clearing away the dirty or undesirable elements is what they're doing. And absolutely that you're pruning those neurons or those connections that don't mean anything anymore. I think it's interesting, in sort of how close am I to joining a cult sort of question, right? A thought experiment might be, what kind of a cult would I join?
Right.
Or what kind of cult would I form? And if I were to form a cult, how would I choose those people, and how would I keep them in there? In order to make it successful, you can't just go club somebody over the head and say, you're going to be in my cult. They'll look for the first opportunity they can to get out of there. And so what kind of a cult would I join? And I kind of think about, all right, well, they have to like cats. So that's how they would get me, right? They'd say there's a free cat adoption, or just you can go pet cats. That's how they would get me. And they're like, oh, and you can pet them and you don't have to change their litter and whatever. And this one's Spaghetti-O and this one's Mr. Whiskers. And I'd just be, oh my God. And so again, like Chris is saying, you kind of become like hooked on that. But what kind of a cult would you be likely to join? And to successfully join it, this is not done overnight. It's done incrementally.
Right.
And any one of us can be, I don't think anybody that's in a cult is, that started off with, hey, I'm going to go join a cult. Mm-hmm. No, that's not what happens. What happens is that, and cults aren't going to get everyone, and they don't want everyone. They need an enemy. They need others out there. I mean, everyone needs to have a boogeyman out there. If everyone were a member of the cult, if we're all one world, oh my God, how awful would that be? We'd all have something. We wouldn't have anything to complain about or anyone to fight against or anybody to blame our problems on. I mean, we need that as humans.
Well, and the cult leader couldn't have that either, because what are they feeding their power off of other than the fact that they are the protector, the ones that are giving them the wisdom and the guidance to escape that enemy. I mean, that's, without, if everybody were in it, then the leader wouldn't have a real place of power in the organization anymore. And you will see too, as the different types of cults that I'll be covering and throughout the season, I'm honestly flying by the seat of my pants as to how this is going to go in terms of who's going to be on with me. I would love to have you two back, by the way. But I
think she's talking to you.
No, both of you.
I think it's you and Spaghetti-O she wants back.
Honestly, could you imagine being love bombed by kittens? I just feel like that would be the end of me. Like, I mean, I would murder to get that. Yeah, I would.
I'm predicting it now. Allison starts the cat cult. Bart is the first person to join.
Mm-hmm. And then I become one of those enforcers. So I'm like, well, you don't like cats? The fuck is wrong with you?
You're part of the ruling cattery of
cattery. Get out of here. It has to be Egyptian themed, because the Egyptians really had a thing about cats, right? So you'd have to have a little Egyptian
they
kind
knew
of
what they were
iconography.
talking about.
We're gonna have a pyramid. It's gonna be great. But I want to have a mixture. I might have to deliver some of these episodes solo depending on schedules and whatnot, but I will be covering each episode of this season. After this primer episode is going to cover a different type of cult, and we'll use other cults as sort of examples within that. So for instance, destructive cults, which is a very broad term. But I do want to delve a little more into that in another episode. And that's just referring to groups whose members have, through deliberate action, physically injured or killed other members of their own group or other people. Nearly every cult I'm going to talk about this season has some form of destructive element, but that one in particular is when things escalate to murder within the group. And there are a lot of those. And then there are doomsday cults, and those people believe in the apocalypse. Can also be used to refer to groups that predict disaster, groups that attempt to bring it about. So Om Shinrikyo, that is a big one out of Japan. They are the ones that deployed sarin gas in the Tokyo subway back in the 90s. And their leader was I believe he was just executed just recently here. They killed a lot of people. But there are a lot of these doomsday cults. Political cults, primary interest in political action, usually far left or far right. They're usually an extremist, but I keep bringing up the SLA, but also there's the Unification Church, the Moonies. I know I said church in that term. You might think, oh, that's a religious cult. Not quite. Given that the Moonies' political influence is massive to this day in the United States. We'll get into that pretty hardcore.
And we are so doomed as a species.
Oh, we are. QAnon is also part of that political cult. I would love to be able to delve a little more into QAnon and its foundations. And then there's the polygamy and sex cults. That's again, the FLDS is another big part of that. And the Rajneeshis, I think, are another kind of sect of that. I don't think they were polygamists, but there was definitely a sex cult aspect to that cult. And then there's, of course, the racist cults, the KKK, Aryan Nation, neo-Nazis, all these guys. Then this is the one, again, I'm looking most forward to, the MLMs. I have a particular desire to go after not so much the established cults, but the ones that are pretending to be legitimate businesses that rope people in under the simple guise of wanting to make a little extra money for their families. And what they end up doing is bankrupting millions of people. And I find them to be particularly insidious because I actually have a lot of friends involved in MLMs, and I don't hold that against them personally, but I look at the hierarchy, I look at the organization, and I'm like, you evil money siphoning pieces of shit. I have a lot of anger toward MLMs, as you can tell.
I'm detecting that.
I don't. I think
picking that up through the screen.
I honestly, I do feel it's because as someone who was a stay-at-home mom for a number of years, MLMs were geared right at someone like me directly. In fact, I've been given that pitch a lot. And I think if I were a little less resistant or a little less completely consumed with my other millions of projects in my life, I probably would have ended up doing one. And it's scary, you know? So I guess personally, I identify with that. If there was a cult that I could have ended up in, it probably would have been like Pampered Chef or something. So examples of multi-level marketing, Amway is one of the most well-known. Mary Kay, LuLaRoe, Thrive. Oh my God, there are so many, even ones that sell sex toys. I mean, there are a ton of them. What is the other one? Advocare. That's any ones that sell like diet supplements, and It Works. That's another one. I mean, it's just, there are thousands of them. And then there are the social media, contemporary rando cults. It's sort of a grab bag category in a way, because we have Nexium. That's a bit of everything. That's a sex cult and an MLM. And they did a bunch of other stuff too, but that whole situation is probably going to fall under that. And then we have Teal Swan is another one. So there are a couple of those actually that thrive mainly through Instagram and YouTube and other forms of social media. And that's a new kind of thing that is alarming in its own way. It makes the legal ramifications dicey as well, because good luck trying to explain how social media can induce people to join a cult on social media and also to end one's own life. Explain that to your 95-year-old congressman when it comes to drafting laws that protect against this, or explain that to an ancient judge or jury that doesn't even know, they're still using a flip phone from the 90s. I mean, there's still so much technological disconnect in this country that the social media cult is particularly insidious, because most people just don't relate to it or understand it at all. So that is my list of cults and things that I hope to cover in future episodes.
That is a ding dong dark list right there. That is a whole lot of darkness ahead of us. Oh man,
it's coming, guys.
You've made me feel very, very welcome on this broadcast. So I'd be happy to be on again.
Okay.
If you would allow me.
And I'm going to bring Chris. We're just going to have our nice little club here. Our little cult.
I like this. I like our little group.
Our little kitty cult.
Are we now members of the Ding Dong Darkness cult? Is that what's going on here?
Chris doesn't have a cat, but he loves ice cream. So can we have ice cream as part of the
Oh my God. If there was an ice cream cult, that's my answer to your question earlier. What kind of cult would you join and or start? I'm too lazy to start a cult, but I would definitely join
You would,
an ice cream cult.
You're just listening for that bell.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And we can bring Pavlov into this and bring it all back to our roots.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Little BF Skinner, little operant conditioning. Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Oh, man.
I'm nerding out.
Oh, man.
See, Bart, at the beginning of this, before we started doing the show, he's like, I'm never going to do this again. And I did say, no, man, I'm going to get you hooked. You are literally, this is the cult forming experience.
Yeah. I'm going to go talk to my sponsor after this, my extractor, my handler, or whatever you call it.
All right. Well, I'm going to wrap it up here. And I want to thank you, Dr. Bart and Chris, so much for joining me on this. And I look forward to having you back on again. Now, first of all, go check out Chris, his podcast, 80s High, back for season, is it 3 that is? And Bart's
there's
cat.
a kitty. There's a kitty.
Bart has brought his cat. See, the cult's already beginning. But Chris, you're on season 3 of 80s High now,
Yeah,
is that right?
season 3, junior year starting. We've got a couple episodes out there now and more to keep dropping throughout the year. So yeah, go check it out, please.
Yeah, as of this recording, I listened to the episode on the board games from the 80s. I mean, it's such a great 80s nostalgia. So go and check that out. Now, Bart.
I have got a horror movie cliche bingo game called Horror. You can actually, I bought the website at horr-o.com. It's like,
it's really great.
Yeah, it's what happens when you mix psychology and edibles. So, and I've got, what else have I got going on? I've got a number of things. I've got a podcast, not podcast. I've got a YouTube channel that I'm starting up and a TikTok channel to try and what I've got a book out there from a while ago called Psychu.
Psychu is great. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. It's forensic haikus, and so I'm making some videos. I'm using ArtGrid and making videos that are based on the forensic haikus. It sounds way worse than it is. So.
It's amazing.
That sounds amazing. Yeah,
they're really good videos, and I will link to all those in the show notes so that people can go check that out and listen. I just knew when I got Bart roped into this and hoped that he would enjoy it enough, because I've been putting in his brain, we're going to do a whole other thing on prison, and it's going to happen because I'm putting it out there. It's going to happen.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So I told Bart, I want to do a whole season on prison and
the humanity of crime.
Yes. It has been, it's just been this project that's been out there, and it's just all about reeling people in. I need to be apparently that charismatic guru around which people will assemble. So
you got your first 2 followers here.
Yes, awesome. Build the cult of ding dong darkness.
Yep, bring cats and ice cream.
That's right. Everyone go listen only to this podcast and no other podcasts, because they are wrong and they're against you. Thank you.
They are. If you think that they have something. All right. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for listening, and I'll be back next week. And until then, be good, you little ding dongs.
Yeah, be good.
Or not.
Or not.
Ding Dong Darkness Time has been brought to you and produced by yours truly, Allison Dixon. It was made possible by an array of amazing co-hosts, friends, family, but especially you, the listeners. Big shouts also go out to the brilliant Nathaniel Dixon for the show art and future legend Spencer Morlock for all the music. I'll be back again soon with another episode. In the meantime, be good, you little ding dongs.